My name is Betsy Levy Paluck, and I'm a social psychologist at Princeton University. My question is, what works to reduce prejudice in our world? So, how can we reduce expressions of prejudice, derogatory and hate speech, discrimination and violence? And for many around the nation and the world, this past summer's Black Lives Matter protests brought this question into focus. We've also been asking this question in response to treatment of migrants and refugees and of Asian Americans. What can we do? How can we reduce prejudice? So I'm a social psychologist. I came to this question in my third year of graduate school when I was the teaching assistant for my mentor, Donald Green, who was a political scientist, and he was teaching a class called Political Intolerance and Hate Speech. And Don asked me to help him find papers for the last meeting of the class, which would be devoted to solutions. He asked me to look at the psychology research literature where prejudice reduction is a major topic of study, to find research on solutions that had been demonstrated to change behavior in the world using really rigorous research methods. And I thought this would be an easy task. But with these two conditions, change behavior in the world, one, and examining the solution with research methods that could show that the intervention had a causal impact, I came up short. This failure changed my career. I spent the rest of my time in graduate school trying to find every single study of prejudice reduction that had ever been done in any field of study or in the policy or nonprofit world, published or unpublished. And Don and I wrote about my collected findings in 2009. Our bottom line was that we didn't know what were the most effective tools to reduce prejudice because the research was insufficient. To understand what kinds of interventions could reduce prejudice in the world, we need randomized controlled experiments, the kind that we've been relying on in the past year to know whether our vaccines are safe and effective. Experiments can tell us if a program, an encounter, a training, a campaign, an exercise, whatever tools we're using to reduce prejudice are causing prejudice reduction. We wouldn't take vaccines based on studies that just ask people for their impressions of how they had changed after taking the vaccine or their thoughts on the experience. So we need evidence of how it caused change, and we need to take prejudice, racism, religious hatred, ethnic dehumanization, prejudice against those who are not able-bodied. We need to take it as seriously as we do the pandemic. So we wrote this review in 2009 as a challenge to the field and to the huge private and nonprofit industries of bias reduction, sensitivity training, diversity training, educational and media programming, and so forth. And we called for serious research and experimentation. And from that moment on, I set about doing that work myself as well. So 2 years ago, we realized that soon it would be a dozen years since I had searched the research literature for evidence of what we know about reducing prejudice. And in the intervening years, we had conducted our own experiments on prejudice and violence reduction, observed our colleagues, and I had been able to research some of these projects with my own students after I had become a professor at Princeton. So our question was, what had happened since that time? And as the clock ticked toward 2020, we searched the literature again. And we wrote a paper that asked 3 questions. So first of all, what had happened in research on prejudice reduction in the last dozen years? Second, what did the research find? How powerful were these interventions? What was their average effect in the world? And then third, can social science answer the public's call to reduce prejudice in the world? So I'm going to tell you the answers right now. First, there's been a sharp uptick in prejudice reduction research. This is great news for the research endeavor. Some of these studies are extremely exciting. They're very strong research, and they're looking at innovative programming that we should know about and learn from. And then second, the typical type of prejudice reduction intervention takes a particular form. It's brief, it's an individualized experience. Third, some of our most popular ideas for reducing prejudice have very little evidence behind them. So things like implicit bias training and diversity training overall. And then fourth and finally, the group of studies that are the strongest and the most careful, they show only very modest reductions in prejudice. So what does this mean for our efforts to reduce prejudice in the world? I want to describe these findings in a bit more detail, but what I want to say first is that they lead me to a different conclusion compared to the one that I reached as a graduate student. As a student looking at our studies of prejudice reduction, I thought we just needed better research. But now, with some time passing, I think that we actually need to rethink our approach to how we try to reduce prejudice in the first place, not just better studies to understand the impact of what we've done. And specifically, most prejudice reduction programming that we've been able to evaluate up to this point is aimed at changing our individual ideas, experiences, and goals. And the new approach I think we need to take, the one that I think we need to focus on and put our energies behind, is designing and evaluating prejudice reduction programming that aims at our collective ideas and our collective experiences. So let me explain a little bit more how I reached this conclusion and then what it means. So first, the uptick in research. Over the past 12 years, we found about 481 randomized controlled experiments testing various approaches to reducing prejudice, reaching in the last year of our review about 60 experiments per year. This is great news, especially because some of these experiments are enormously enlightening, and I want to tell you about some of them. These top experiments are the ones that were testing programming out in the world that was aimed at people's social and political realities in addition to their psychological biases. And they used excellent research methods to test their impact, really large samples of people who were involved, cutting edge statistics, and they made their process and their data public so that other researchers could see how they'd done it. So, for example, two separate studies tested the idea that bringing people together to cooperate with one another for a common goal could reduce prejudice. Both were conducted by ambitious PhD students who looked to sports as an arena where cooperation is particularly compelling and powerful. So in northern Iraq, Salma Musa tested whether Christians and Muslims brought together in a local soccer league would be more likely to interact, form friendships, patronize one another's businesses, and even shift some of their policy attitudes after playing on the same team or on opposite teams. In India, Matt Lowe tested a similar question, bringing low and high caste men together to play cricket. So whether sports can bring us together in our daily lives is an age-old question, and yet they were making new progress on it. This was one of the first times it had been tested with scientific rigor, and they found modest and mixed effects. So people in their studies were more likely to interact with one another and even collaborate outside of the league, but these effects had limits, and there was no impact, for example, on their policy attitudes. Another study that was excellent tested whether confronting people online when they use racist language worked to reduce the expression of racist slurs, specifically using the N-word against other Twitter users. So in this study, another doctoral student, Kevin Munger, tested whether people from one's own racial group and whether people with many followers versus few followers on the social media platform were more effective at discouraging racist language. And he tracked whether this impact endured over time or not. The answer was that white men with lots of followers were most effective at discouraging other white men from using racist language, and that the effect lasted for weeks. And then some studies were heroic because they studied programs that many of us find ourselves in, but programs about which we surprisingly know very little. So in one experiment testing an online diversity training, Edward Chang and his colleagues studied an international corporation that used an online diversity training, and they tracked employee attitudes, but also their actual behaviors, like whether they supported colleagues who were underrepresented at the company. They found almost no effects of the training, except for effects on women and people of color at the company, who became even more supportive of others following the training. So these are some examples of the outstanding studies that made real progress on our questions about what works to reduce prejudice. The typical types of studies we found, however, used very different techniques. For example, the most popular approach that we found over the past dozen years is one that didn't even exist when I was doing this review as a graduate student. This approach is about contact with members of other groups, but not actual contact, like in the soccer or cricket leagues. In these studies, investigators ask whether thinking about your friends who are connected to members of other groups, or just imagining having contact with other groups, could reduce your prejudice. The next category of training modules used emotional and thought regulation strategies, such as empathy, perspective taking, or rethinking stereotypes as a way of reducing prejudice. And finally, the third most popular category of intervention was also a bit of a thought exercise. It was one in which people are asked to rethink the boundaries of groups to be more inclusive, like recategorizing immigrants as neighbors in your mind, thinking about them with different categorical schemes. This figure demonstrates how the average prejudice reduction strategy works at the moment, at least the kind that are allowed to be evaluated by researchers. The typical strategy is to reduce prejudice reduction through an individual's mental life, to try to change expressions of prejudice by changing the way an individual thinks or feels about the group. Additionally, we noted that 76% of all interventions in programming could be characterized as light touch programming. This is a term that means the intervention was easy to implement, brief, and cheap. And this might be really great for spreading the programming across large amounts of the population. But then the question is it working? So what is the average effect of all of these programs according to this research? Looking at the best of them, the experiments of the highest quality, the impact is very modest. It's a standardized effect of 0.18, and here's how that translates. Say I measured your prejudice on a 100-point scale, where 0 means you're very prejudiced, you feel very coldly toward another group. 50 means you're neutral, and 100 means you have no prejudice, you feel very warmly, you love the other group. So let's take a person who isn't super prejudiced according to this scale. They're at a 40. On average, from all the work that we found that was evaluated by the very best research, the interventions would move that person from a 40 to a 44. So we might argue that this is not the change that we need to see in the world, but maybe it's okay. Maybe it's encouraging especially if we repeat the programming and these small changes add up over time. So the other problem is that we have no evidence that this additive process is happening. So very few researchers are doing this kind of long-term research to see whether repeating these kinds of interventions helps the 40 to become a 44, to become a 48, and so forth. There are other really important holes in this research. For example, there are only 2 high-quality studies of diversity training and very few studies of whether implicit bias training works or if implicit bias changes following any kind of training. And what this means is that 2 of our most popular responses to racist, sexist, or other kinds of prejudiced events in the world, to give people this kind of training, has no support in the research as an effective tool for action. Perhaps some of it is effective, but for several reasons, including that many of these trainings are proprietary businesses, many companies refuse to open their doors to researchers when they are engaging in these trainings, we don't know if they're working, and even if they're having a negative effect. As I mentioned, I used to think that better research would help us to answer this question of what reduces prejudice, because there are many good ideas out there. But this present research that we just completed has left me facing the possibility that better and better research on our current popular solutions will only show us that the programming is not doing much. And that's what this figure shows. So as the errors in the research get smaller, the size of the impact of the program gets smaller too. So these data suggest that if we keep using the same ideas, our improved research is going to show us that we're not changing anything at all, that the impact of the average intervention is close to 0. So what should we do? I think that we need to change the way we think about our programming. So currently, many of these programs, the ones designed by researchers and the ones designed by practitioners, they think about prejudice as a problem inside of our minds. And people design programs to address individuals and their individual thoughts and feelings and experiences. And of course, we all know that prejudice is something that pervades society, is a social phenomenon, is present in our structures. And so I think that we need to start designing our interventions in a way that reflects this knowledge. I think we need to start designing programs that change structures in society as a way of changing our individual thoughts and feelings and experiences. It is still really important to change individuals. As a psychologist, I feel that, and I see evidence of that. But we also have evidence that individuals are changed by their contexts, maybe less so the other way around. It's very hard for individuals alone to change their contexts. So what do we mean then about changing structures or changing our collective experiences as a way of reducing expressions of prejudice in the world? Of course, by structures, I mean things that we all recognize, like institutions, rules, leadership. An example I use sometimes is that traditionally, our approach can be likened to studying a single training at a company, a corporation, say a white fragility training. And then the research question becomes, a few years down the line, do we see more Black board members at that company? The reverse, what I'm suggesting here, is that we change the representation and increase the number of Black board members on that company. And then a few years down the line, see whether white fragility has shifted at that corporation. But also, I think that we should think about the kinds of ways that we can change collective experiences with less formal structures. I think this also matters with pop culture, with social media movements, with collective action. These tools of collective change also affect how larger groups of people think about things together and affect how they perceive the standards of their community. Because here's something I've learned about prejudice along the way from my own research. We know that the expression of prejudice is often held back if people think that those around them, their community, don't support prejudice. On the flip side, hate crime research shows that people are more likely to commit hate crimes when they think that their community supports them and their views. So we should design prejudice reduction interventions according to these insights about prejudice. Rather than aiming for brief, individualized treatments, we should use tools that change our collective experiences, our perceptions of community standards. We need leaders, public statements, rules, and collective attention and movements. Our data from this review, I think it provides a mandate to think big, to think ambitiously. The data say that we can't just train away prejudice. It is up to us to think big, and this insight will define the next stage of my career, but I hope also the next stage of innovation, practice, and research around reducing prejudice in the world.